Again, my name is Jeff Jones. I'm with Life Transition Services. I work with Janet Pollock, and she's an elder law attorney in Westchester. About 10 years ago, we started this company because of the situation we found in our own family. And after going through long-term care experience several times with several family members, we thought that people would need, and particular families would need, additional help with the situations they have with long-term care. Janet and I were able to present before, so I thought, well, I wanted to go to the next step and talk about the basics, because a lot of times the basics are important in going forward, but then kind of go beyond that as well, because certainly your experience a lot of times as caregivers, in a lot of ways you know more than the experts. That's what we're finding out, particularly if experts don't deal with long-term care situations day to day. And why don't we begin really our conversation. So one thing we notice about caregivers in the issues that they have is that these issues happen simultaneously and they're interrelated. You can't just talk about healthcare issues, or you can't just talk about financial or legal issues, because they interact with each other. And depending what the circumstances are, that will determine what options a family has and what decisions they would like to make. That being said, there is an order to it, however. And what we find is, in terms of working with situations, the first and foremost is that if you're taking care of somebody, their health care is the most important. In particular, the person needs to be in a safe and appropriate environment. That's always step one. And in doing that and thinking kind of what does it take in order to make sure the person is in that kind of environment, not only now but in the future, a lot of times it clarifies the direction and decisions that need to be taking place. The second part are really the legal issues. There's 5 basic areas that we'll talk about on the next slide, or in the next few slides, that family, it would be good if they have addressed, because without the proper legal authority, it becomes difficult to, number one, have other professionals work with you. And second is that it becomes difficult to know what the wishes of the person is who you're taking care of as well. And then the third part of the long-term care issues are really the financial issues. In a lot of ways, they can be the most apparent, where assets are being spent down for the cost of care. And as we'll talk about in a few slides, cost of care can be very significant in a very short period of time. And a lot of times, that's when it can really, quote unquote, hit families. It's like, wow, this is different than what we've really been experiencing before, because the healthcare situation would get to the point where decisions need to be made quickly. And what we're interested in is having families be prepared, for that possibility, so they know what to do if the situation arises. And then the fourth part we really look at is quality of life. And that's what really, you want to lay the foundations with the other 3 areas in order to improve that quality of life. We really like the idea of having a lot of problems go away so you can get back to having a good relationship, a less stressful relationship, and a well-organized and well-planned relationship now and going forward as well. So it's very interesting. I'm a certified senior advisor, and that's part of a nationwide group, actually, that it's multidisciplinary. We have people in the fields, visiting nursing, paralegal, legal. Um, in terms of finances, they could be insurance people, as well as sometimes annuity. So we have a lot of variety of fields, but the common idea is that all of the businesses are having their business for seniors and caregivers and their families in order to help them provide products and services. So every 3 years I go for recertification that way, and it's very interesting how there are a couple of areas on this presentation that are in particular are really key points. And one of the interesting areas I just completed a few months ago, going to the class, they were really focusing in on what is that transition time from retirement, okay, into going into that you need to be thinking about long-term care issues. And so they actually we kind of brainstormed in the class and came up with a list. One area is if there's car damage that's really unexplained that way. Another are financial issues like bounced or missing checks. These are things that, and certainly these can be common, but what we're more looking at is if it's unusual that something like this would happen, okay? And unnecessary services or products. One of our families, one time we asked them, how did you know that you needed to go see somebody? And they said, because mom put a package in the microwave and tried to cook it for an hour, okay? So, I mean, those are the kind of like warning signs at that point. And it may be not a particular thing, but just a general idea of unusual depression or of social isolation, a change of behavior that way. And so the big thing is some of these issues, it can be an issue of the family noticing it and just kind of looking at it and adapting as it goes along. But you have to be careful because these changes can also be so gradual that unless you look back and see how it's progressing, it can cause a family to think, well, that's just normal, and it may actually not be. And again, it goes back to the idea, do the issues that come up, do they affect the idea of a person being in a safe and appropriate environment? Again, that's the standard. If you feel something is unsafe or inappropriate, then that's the time to start talking, certainly among family members, and start thinking about things. So in terms of healthcare issues, one of the standard ways that a lot of, in the healthcare field, that they look at what they call activities of daily living. And the list is eating, bathing, dressing, toileting, transfer, and continence. And that's something that I guess for a lot of you are already familiar with that. Is that because that's a very standard terminology that way? What's kind of curious is over the past few months, we've been getting reports from families that their family member has been having issues with several of these, but yet a place where the family member is residing, like be it if they temporarily need hospital care or they're talking to a healthcare professional, even though they need help with several of these, the healthcare professional is saying, well, they don't really need an advanced level of skilled care. And I'm kind of curious because I've been hearing this a little bit more often than in the past, and I'm not sure. One of the key things about all of this is that I'm a big believer in the intuition of the caregiver. feel there's something not quite right, irregardless of what somebody else says, I would highly suggest trust your own instincts, because nobody's going to know the situation like you do. And we've had families that would come in and they would say, well, you know, I was told everything was okay, but it just didn't seem right. And as it turned out, it really was a good idea that they actually had the chance to talk to somebody to either explain how things were set up, or to explain, well, actually, you're right, there is something wrong, you know. And I think that's, you know, those, in particular with healthcare issues, that's important. One other thing is that the ADLs, they don't include mental or psychological issues, meaning like wandering or aggression. Okay? Those can be important issues in the future because if a person does go to a residence that has skilled nursing services at a level, one of the things they're going to be looking at is, can they provide the resources to the person and for the family that is appropriate for the level of care that they need? For example, there's one residence, a skilled nursing residence in Chester County. They can't accept somebody who wanders because they literally have 27 doors, and they cannot guarantee that the person wouldn't leave the residence at that point. That's kind of in addition to the activities of daily living. But the ADLs, they help provide a guideline in terms of what skilled level we're looking at. Typically, if the person doesn't need help with any, then they can be at home or independent living. Generally, if they need help with 1 to 2, they can go to assisted living or a personal care home. And if they need 3 or more, typically you're looking more at the skilled nursing level of care. You know, I put the personal care home, it's very interesting because that's somewhat of a newer designation. And there was just a discussion with state level people, and they were talking about how legally there is no term such as assisted living in Pennsylvania. I'm not an attorney, I'm just in working with attorneys and kind of going back and forth that way. So a more legal term in Pennsylvania at least is personal care home. What makes that interesting is that in some of the benefits, be it, for example, with long-term care insurance, or possibly even veterans benefits, when some places that provide both independent living and assisted living, when they describe their services, they say personal care home. Well, in Pennsylvania, their attitude is that a personal care home qualifies as long-term care, possibly under the long-term care insurance, as well as, and this would be a very interesting idea, I would like to at some point talk to a veterans representative for the veterans program called Aid and Attendance. And what that does is it begins to, if the personal care home standard is used, that can potentially blur the line somewhat between independent living and assisted living, okay? Because independent livings have been calling themselves personal care homes as well. So it's going to be very interesting how that works out, but I just wanted to make you aware that the assisted living and skilled nursing used to be how things were separated, but the personal care home designation can make things a lot more, possibly allow a lot more benefits for families in the future. You know, if that standard is used by long-term care insurance companies as well as the government. In terms of the legal issues, basically 5 areas are looked at with that. First, usually, how many people, if you're taking care care of somebody now, have power of attorney for that person. That's great. That's good. Because that makes it that much easier for other businesses, other professionals to work with you that way. The next is will, living will, healthcare power of attorney, and the new one, or relatively new one, is called family agreement. And that's somewhat unique among elder law attorneys. The idea is that when you are looking at particularly government benefits in the future to pay for the cost of care, the question becomes, if a transaction happens with you and your parent, is it a gift, or are you being reimbursed for expenses, or are you being reimbursed for services? And that can make a very important distinction, because the problem is that if you're applying for government benefits in the future for a family member, and the government looks at the transaction and says, well, why did that transaction take place? They would say, well, I was doing work for mom or for dad or for the person I was taking care of, and they paid me for it. And they would say, well, where's the agreement that said you could do that? And the problem is you can't go back. So if you have a family agreement ahead of time, there are a couple of interesting things that happen that way. One is it begins to formalize, and people kind of have an open and objective standard for what services you're providing. It can actually provide a structure, which is good because it gives you, it not only says what you are doing for the person, but allows other people to see that as well. And then it shows that, for example, the compensation that you got for that service was, fair and reasonable that way. So when the government, if they are looking at transactions as part of the review process and applying for benefits, if they say what happened, during here, you can actually show the family agreement ahead of time, and then the transactions that happened after the family agreement will be covered under there. So, and that's somewhat unique in terms of elder law, because a lot of times that situation doesn't happen in terms of estate planning and things like that. They have other mechanisms to take care of that. Now, one of the key things here is what happens if you don't have these. And unfortunately, for example, with power of attorney, if you don't have that, the possibility may be that you need to apply for guardianship. And that tends to be a lot more expensive, more time consuming, and it can unfortunately cause duress to a family that way. And it doesn't happen often, fortunately, and but when it does, it can take at least several months, and the court gets involved. And if a person doesn't have a will, that's when intestacy laws take place. And is anyone familiar with that, the idea? The idea is if you don't have a will that defaults to the state determines how things are taken care of. And that's set inside the code. Again, I'm not an attorney. The idea is I just want to make you aware, what happens if these documents aren't set up. And the same kind of issues happen here. Overall, the idea is if you don't plan, you're giving up control. If you don't have the documents, you give up that control. And that's why it's better to take care of things sooner rather than try to take care of them later, because it can cause a lot of inconvenience later on, and a lot of the issues can be solved when the issues are smaller and that everybody's in control that way. And one of the, it's interesting, this graph on the right, it's a rather common graph that I see, and it causes me concern because certainly these areas are important, especially for seniors, the idea of retirement planning, having basically safe and secure retirement in terms of income and maintaining assets. Estate planning, which gets involved with the will, how you want your assets distributed. Tax planning, you want to minimize your taxes and make sure you're paying the appropriate taxes. But what I see when families come in is that's not enough. Because unfortunately, each of these areas, they don't take care of one of the core things, particularly when it comes to long-term care, and it has to do with the cost of long-term care. When somebody's in a long-term care situation, you always have what your cost of living is. Your utilities, your house expenses, car expenses, food, clothing, that. What long-term care does, however, is it causes assets to be spent down very quickly and in a high amount. In terms of what expenses are we looking at, if somebody goes from home into a long-term care environment, now if they're going to an independent living where it's basically they're just the new residence is taking care of the basics but not providing, for example, care for any of the activities of daily living. Generally, in this area, the expenses, it tends to be $1,000 to $2,000 a month. And usually for families, that's not a significant burden. It can be, depending on the circumstances, but many times it's not a significant burden that way. But when you start looking at assisted living or skilled nursing, that's when the expenses really begin to mount up. And that's when families really start to really look at in terms of spend down of assets that way, and how are the assets going to last, for the person? How is the person going to continue to have that level of care provided that they need? And I'm a big fan of the idea of a safety net, and because we want families to know that there are structures in place that can help them. That yes, the cost of care can be expensive if a person's in that situation, but there are ways to handle and manage the assets. There are ways to apply for government benefits if you qualify for it. And it's that kind of planning ahead, I think, that's very important. The two key areas are, one, paying for the cost of care itself, but oftentimes if there's a spouse at home, we want to make sure that they're protected as well, okay? Because the cost of care, in general, a person's care will be taken care of. But what happens is we have to make sure that the person at home is taken care of as well. You have to do both at the same time. And that's sometimes where it gets a little bit complicated. And the idea of the level of benefits, particularly with government benefits, that it can be of two types. One is it can provide a monthly income stream. Okay? And we'll talk about that the next slide. The second is, for lack of a better way of saying it, it provides a floor. Meaning the idea is that the assets would get spent down to a degree, but when you get to that point, it'll stop. Then it's not, the assets don't need to be spent anymore. And so the assets that are left are basically protected for the person. So this is very important, especially if there's a spouse at home who has to maintain the home, maintain their own cost of living, and provide, for themselves while the spouse in the long-term care residence is being taken care of. So I split it into two types of safety nets. And one would be public or government-based, and the other being private, which would be either through long-term care insurance or even the at-home, the family support. That's a huge part. Now, in terms of what they would be looking at is the level of care, how much care. Typically at home, you would have less level of care. That is, for many families, the ideal situation to stay at home. And in Pennsylvania, what's interesting is that they actually have what they call the at-home waiver program. And what that is the idea is if somebody needs skilled nursing services, but they could stay at home, they don't have to go to a skilled nursing residence. The state would provide the services at the home level, and this is actually through the Department of Aging as well as the County Assistance Office. The Department of Aging in Chester County is located on Westtown Road. They provide a wide variety of services for families. One of them is administering the waiver program. And it's usually a two-step process for families. First, once an initial application is made, the Department of Aging goes out and looks at the general situation to see if it's appropriate. Then they make a second visit to see what specific services are needed for the person to be at home. So then they provide contracts for providers to come in and actually provide those services for the family that way. And we've actually worked with many families who have had that. And it's like so many situations, the family works with the providers coming in, and they've had very good results that way. So that's certainly an option. One thing that is somewhat of a concern, it is income limited. They actually look at, and I'm trying to think, this may be a few years old, but it was around $1,600 a month. That if you were above that, I believe they adjusted for cost of living, but it kind of gives you an idea. If somebody is, for example, making $3,000 a month income, they wouldn't qualify for this program, sadly enough. But for people who are below that, the income threshold, it can be a valuable service that way. For independent living itself, I'm not aware of any program that can actually help. I haven't heard of any, and certainly if anybody, we get great ideas from families, so if anybody ever hears of anything, please let us know that way. For assisted living, there's a program for veterans. It's actually wartime veterans or the surviving spouse of a deceased wartime veteran. Now keep in mind that when they talk about wartime veteran, what determines wartime is actually voted on by Congress. There are very specific dates that they look at that way. And so sometimes people say, well, the war was over by the time their husband had joined the service. And well, if we go back and look at the dates, we might find that actually those dates got extended beyond what the family considered the end of the war. So in some ways, it pays to look at what the actual dates are that way. And they are published, and certainly you can always give us a call, and we can let you know that as well. Most of our families are, somebody's in the wartime service. Generally, it's World War II, some Korea, and even some Vietnam. You know, that way we're starting to see some for our younger residents, long-term care residents who we're helping the family with. And then for skilled nursing, the major program tends to be medical assistance or Medicaid in terms of government benefits, because it provides the most comprehensive level of care that way. So with medical assistance, when somebody qualifies for that in a skilled nursing environment, It pays for the room and board, the medical, the pharmaceutical, and also ancillary charges. Those are charges, miscellaneous, could be wheelchairs or incontinent supplies or kind of miscellaneous. Generally, the only thing that medical assistance doesn't cover are things like haircuts or telephone or TV, cable TV, things like that. So it is a rather comprehensive program, but another key thing about the medical assistance part is that it is a floor, meaning that it's comprehensive coverage, and once you qualify, you do not have to spend your own assets to pay for it. Now, your income in general, your income does go towards the cost of care. They make a very big distinction between what your assets are, what I should say the long-term care residents' assets are, and what their income is. However, it is possible if there's a spouse at home, if they don't meet federal guidelines with their own income, they can tap into the income of the long-term care resident. So, for example, if roughly for the federal standard now is about $2,000 a month. So if the person at home